Die Kunstgeschichte und die offizielle Chronologie verlangen oft von uns, an Dinge zu glauben, die bei näherer Betrachtung zu bröckeln beginnen, wie altes Mauerwerk. Eines der faszinierendsten Rätsel der letzten Jahrhunderte ist die Figur des Giovanni Battista Piranesi. Man erzählt uns, er sei ein genialer Künstler und Kupferstecher gewesen, dessen Fantasie Bilder von majestätischen Ruinen und zyklopischen Bauwerken hervorbrachte. Es gibt jedoch eine unerbittliche Statistik, die allein schon die physische Möglichkeit in Zweifel zieht, dass ein einzelner Mensch ein solches Arbeitsvolumen von Hand schaffen könnte. Forscher, die das Vermächtnis des Meisters akribisch nachgezählt haben, kamen zu einem verblüffenden Schluss. Um eine solche Menge an Kupferplatten mit Darstellungen höchster Detaillierung zu hinterlassen, hätte Piranesi eine fertige Gravur pro Woche produzieren müssen. Denken Sie über diese Zahl nach. Eine Gravur pro Woche, sein ganzes schöpferisches Leben lang, ohne Wochenenden, ohne Krankheiten und ohne kreative Krisen. Wir sprechen hier nicht von einfachen Skizzen oder Entwürfen, sondern von monumentalen Werken, die mit Millionen winziger Striche gesättigt sind. Jeder, der mit der Technik der Radierung vertraut ist, weiß, dass dies eine knochenharte, erschöpfende Arbeit ist. Der Meister muss das Metall mit Lack überziehen, das spiegelverkehrte Bild mit juwelierhafter Präzision mit einer Nadel hineinkratzen, es mit Säure ätzen, dann Korrekturen vornehmen und den Prozess viele Male wiederholen, um die Tiefe der Schatten zu erreichen. Die Herstellung auch nur einer solchen Platte von Hand unter Einhaltung perfekter Perspektive und architektonischer Genauigkeit dauert normalerweise Monate. Uns aber will man weismachen, Piranesi habe dies in wenigen Tagen erledigt, als arbeite er an einem Fließband, das im 18. Jahrhundert noch gar nicht existierte. Diese arithmetische Unstimmigkeit zwingt uns, nach anderen Erklärungen zu suchen. Entweder war dieser Mann nicht nur ein Genie, sondern ein Wesen mit übermenschlicher Arbeitskraft und Geschwindigkeit, oder er besaß eine Technologie, über die Historiker lieber schweigen. Es gibt eine gewagte Hypothese, die unsere Vorstellung vom technischen Fortschritt der Vergangenheit auf den Kopf stellen könnte. Was, wenn diese Bilder gar nicht das Ergebnis der Handarbeit eines Graveurs sind? Was, wenn wir hier keine Zeichnungen vor uns haben, sondern das Ergebnis eines hochtechnologischen Prozesses, eine Art Fotodruck der ausgewählten Meistern lange vor der offiziellen Erfindung der Daguerreotypie zugänglich war? Wenn wir annehmen, dass Piranesi kein Fantasiekünstler war, sondern einer der ersten Fotografen der Geschichte, dann ändert sich der gesamte Kontext seiner Arbeiten radikal. In diesem Fall hört alles, was auf seinen Platten festgehalten ist, auf, eine architektonische Fantasie zu sein und wird zu einer dokumentarischen Chronik. Das bedeutet, dass die gigantischen, halb zerstörten Gebäude, die tief in die Erde ragen, und die winzigen Menschen, die zwischen diesen kolossalen Ruinen umherirren, keine Fiktion sind, sondern die objektive Realität jener Zeit. Eine Realität, die uns vielleicht absichtlich verborgen wurde, indem man dokumentarische Aufnahmen zur künstlerischen Fiktion erklärte, damit die Mehrheit der Menschen keine unbequemen Fragen darüber stellt, welche Zivilisation vor uns existierte und wohin sie verschwunden ist.
Než odhalíme tajemství této technologie a ponoříme se do detailů, které mohou navždy změnit tvůj pohled na minulost, ujisti se, že odebíráš náš kanál a klikneš na tlačítko "To se mi líbí". Protože hned poté začneme systematicky bořit známé mýty ze školních učebnic dějepisu. A to si rozhodně nechceš nechat ujít.
Accepting the hypothesis of Piranesi as photographer opens a Pandora's box. It turns out that his works capture the remains of a majestic past world. Immense buildings that are impossible to build with primitive tools, giant statues, and the debris of a destroyed, highly developed civilization. But if he didn't draw these pictures by hand, guiding a needle over varnish, how did the image get onto the metal with such photographic precision? The answer to this question lies not in the miracles of painting, but in the laws of physics and chemistry, which, it turns out, were known to masters much earlier than is commonly believed. To understand how exactly these incredible images were created, we need to delve into the technical details of the process officially attributed to the Italian master. Art historians claim Piranesi worked in the etching technique, known and respected at the time. This method requires the highest precision and a steady hand. A special varnish, resistant to acid, is applied to a polished copper plate. Then the artist takes a sharp needle and scratches through the varnish layer with jeweled precision, exposing the metal. Every line, every stroke that will subsequently appear on paper must be physically applied to the surface of the plate. After the drawing is complete, the plate is immersed in nitric acid, which eats away the copper in the places where the varnish was removed by the tool. To create complex tonal transitions and depth of shadow, this etching process is repeated many times, reapplying varnish and working through the details again and again. Finally, the plate is cleaned, packed with ink that stays in the grooves, and the image is transferred to paper under a press. The resulting print can be replicated almost infinitely. It is the reliability of the copper plate that allows information to be transmitted through centuries, preserving tiny details that might disappear on ordinary paper. However, if one looks closely at the very essence of this technology, a striking similarity becomes obvious to a process the world learned about much later under the name helio gravure, or phototype. The difference between manual etching and early photography on metal is minimal and lies only in the method of applying the image to the protective layer. Let's imagine an alternative scenario that explains the master's incredible productivity. Instead of scratching varnish with a needle for weeks, one can use chemistry. If you apply a light-sensitive compound, a photoresist that changes its properties under the influence of light, instead of simple varnish to the copper plate, the process changes radically. Substances similar to bitumen harden in the light. When exposing an image onto such a plate, the illuminated areas polymerize and become resistant to acid, while the unilluminated areas remain soft and wash off easily. The subsequent stage of etching with nitric acid is absolutely identical to classic etching. The acid corrodes the unprotected metal, creating grooves for the ink. The result is the exact same engraving plate, but created not by a human hand, but by rays of light. Official science dates the appearance of such technologies to the first half of the 19th century, almost 100 years after Piranesi's death. We are told photography was born in the 1830s. However, all the components for this invention were available to humanity long before that. The key element here is the camera obscura, a simple optical device known even to ancient philosophers. Aristotle described the principle of light passing through a small hole, creating an inverted image on the opposite wall of a darkened room. In the 10th century, Arab scientists studied this effect, and in the Renaissance, Leonardo da Vinci and other masters actively used the camera obscura to construct perfect perspective. Piranesi, being a highly educated man of his time, an architect and engineer, certainly knew about the camera obscura. Moreover, he lived in the Age of Enlightenment, when chemistry was making huge strides forward. The suggestion that he could find a composition that fixes an image on metal does not look like science fiction, but like a logical use of the advanced knowledge of that time. He didn't need to invent complex landscapes from his head. He simply needed to set up a camera in front of the object, project the image onto a prepared plate, and fix it. This explains both the phenomenal speed of work and the detailing unattainable for manual labor, where elements invisible to the naked eye can be seen under a magnifying glass. Thus, a picture emerges where Piranesi is not just an artist, but the world's first documentary photographer, using copper plates instead of film. He captured reality with the impartiality of a machine, and if we accept this version as a working hypothesis, If we agree that these engravings are the result of a technological process of fixing reality, then the next, much more frightening question inevitably arises. What exactly did his camera capture? Because the content of these shots causes stupefaction. The landscapes the master captured tell a story radically different from the one written in textbooks. And what is depicted on these plates scares us much more than the lost technology of their creation itself. If we accept as a given that these are not just artistic sketches, but documentary evidence of an era, captured with the help of advanced technologies for that time, the content of these images begins to evoke genuine horror. What is revealed to the attentive researcher on the copper plates resembles the flourishing Roman Empire or the Renaissance least of all. It looks more like a chronicle of survival after a global catastrophe that destroyed a civilization of titans. A panorama of a world unfolds before us that has survived something terrible, and now survivors are trying to adapt its remains for life. The contrast that strikes the eye is simply staggering. On one hand, we see cyclopean structures, giant arches, vaults reaching into the sky, bridges of incredible engineering complexity, and colonnades whose scale suppresses the human spirit. These buildings were clearly erected using technologies and resources unavailable to the people depicted next to them. Architecture here acts not as a background, but as the main protagonist, a silent, majestic, and infinitely lonely witness to past power. The quality of stone processing, the perfect geometry, and the engineering scope speak of a civilization at the peak of its development, a society for which the construction of such colossi was the norm. On the other hand, against the backdrop of these colossal ruins, we see tiny, ragged people. They look like completely alien elements in this stone grandeur. Their way of life is primitive, their clothes resemble rags, and their behavior is more like the habits of savages who have settled in an abandoned city of gods. They burn fires right inside magnificent palaces, blackening thousand-year-old vaults with soot, dry their laundry on fragments of antique statues, and dig in the mud in search of food. These people clearly did not build what surrounds them. Moreover, they are not even capable of maintaining these structures. They are mere temporary inhabitants, squatters occupying the ruins of a world they do not understand, and which likely frightens them with its scale. There is a persistent feeling that between the moment these buildings were erected and the moment they were fixed on the plate, a rupture in the historical fabric occurred. This is not the smooth fading of antiquity stretching over centuries, as historians tell us. This is an instant stoppage of life. The buildings are not just old, they are destroyed by some colossal force. We see fragments of giant columns scattered like matchsticks, broken vaults, and walls torn apart by unknown energy. And vegetation is everywhere. Trees and shrubs grow right on the roofs, roots tear apart the masonry. Nature greedily consumes the creation of human hands. Such a picture is characteristic of places that were suddenly abandoned and left unattended for decades before survivors returned or new settlers arrived. Official art history suggests we consider these works the capriccio genre, architectural fantasy. We are told the author intentionally exaggerated scales and added ruins for drama, following the fashion of the time. But why would a brilliant architect and engineer like Piranesi depict his world in such decay if prosperity reigned around him? Why draw dirt, poverty, and devastation with such manic detail if it is just a figment of the imagination? Fantasies usually paint idealized worlds, castles in the air, and celestial cities. Here, before us, is the harsh, dirty, and uncomfortable truth. This is Post-apocalyptic documentary. Peering into these images, it is impossible to shake the thought that we are looking at the consequences of a war or a natural cataclysm of planetary scale. A majestic civilization was swept away, and barbarians are trying to survive on its wreckage, using the remnants of high technology as simple shelters from rain and wind. But the strangest and most frightening thing in these engravings is not even the contrast between architecture and people. If we cast aside emotions and look at the foundations of the buildings with the dry gaze of an engineer, we can notice details that completely destroy the official version of the artist's fantasies and point to a specific physical event that occurred quite recently by historical standards. Upon detailed study of the architectural elements fixed on the plates, anomalies appear that cannot be explained by artistic intent or the natural course of time. Any engineer or builder looking at these engravings will point out egregious violations of functional logic. We see magnificent buildings whose proportions are distorted not by an architect's error, but by external impact. Arches designed for triumphant passage barely rise above the ground, turning into low crawl spaces. Ground floor windows, which by all canons should let light into the halls, turn out to be half or completely buried under a layer of soil, turning into strange basement vents. Doorways attract particular attention. On many images, it is clearly visible how doors lead nowhere. Their lower part is hidden underground, and the threshold is located somewhere deep below, inaccessible to the eye. Staircases that should lead to main entrances break off, going straight into the soil, as if the building was slowly sinking in quicksand. This does not look like the result of centuries of accumulation of dust and garbage, which official archaeology is used to explaining the rise in soil levels in old cities. The so-called cultural layer grows at a rate of a few millimeters per year, but here we are talking about meters. To hide the first floors of buildings 5 or 6 meters high would require millennia of negligence, while the architectural style points to much closer eras. These observations are confirmed not only by Piranesi's works, but also by the real state of historical buildings in many European cities. Walking through the streets of Rome, Paris, London, or St. Petersburg, one can notice the same picture. Buildings where so-called basement rooms have full-fledged windows going into the ground, and architectural decor typical of main floors. Often, during street reconstruction or laying communications, builders dig up entire floors that no one suspected existed, with preserved doors, window frames, and even pavements located at a depth of several meters from the modern sidewalk level. All this adds up to a single, frightening picture of a global cataclysm. Researchers call this phenomenon the mud flood, or a planetary-scale mudflow catastrophe. Imagine a sudden event accompanied by powerful flows of water, mud, and soil that cover cities, instantly changing the landscape. Liquid soil fills the streets, bursts into houses through windows and doors, hardening into a dense mass and forever preserving the lower tiers of buildings. A layer of sediment 10 or 15 meters deep becomes the new surface of the Earth, upon which survivors begin to walk. This is the exact moment Piranesi captured. He did not fantasize about ruins. He documented a world that had just survived this blow. His engravings show not antiquity destroyed by time, but a recent catastrophe. The buildings look intact, but buried. People in his images are often busy not with construction, but with attempts to dig out entrances or adapt the upper floors, which have now become the ground floors, for housing. The master's engineering gaze fixed the tragedy of a civilization that literally drowned in soil. The walls of Roman forums and temples in his works are often propped up by rough wooden structures to prevent them from collapsing under the pressure of the piled-up earth. This is a chronicle of disaster relief stretching over decades. Acknowledging the fact that the cities of Europe, and possibly the whole world, were buried under a multi-meter layer of soil as a result of a catastrophic event, completely changes the perception of history. If Piranesi worked in the mid-18th century, and Rome was still being dug out before his eyes, it means the cataclysm happened quite shortly before that, perhaps in the 17th or early 18th century. But if a catastrophe of this magnitude happened so recently, just 300 or 400 years ago, Why is there not a single line about it in official history textbooks? Where did the chronicles describing the death of millions and the destruction of infrastructure disappear? A logical question arises. Who needed to erase from human memory an event that redrew the map of the world? And why shift the chronology, making buildings ancient when they were actually built quite recently? The silence of official science regarding obvious facts lying literally under our feet raises even more questions than the findings themselves. Why do modern historians describe the habits of dinosaurs living millions of years ago with such enthusiasm and in the smallest detail, building hypotheses about their social structure and reasons for extinction, but stubbornly ignore the buried floors of buildings in the centers of our cities? The answer to this question may seem cynical, but it is extremely simple. Dinosaurs are safe. They do not threaten the modern world order, do not cast doubt on the legitimacy of current governments, and do not destroy the foundation of academic science. Acknowledging the fact that a global catastrophe, burying the first floors of buildings around the world under a layer of soil, occurred not in prehistoric times, but in the relatively recent past, in the 17th or 18th century, entails the need to rewrite the entire history of mankind. This means admitting several frightening truths that society is not ready for. First, official chronology is falsified. If buildings presented to us as antique heritage thousands of years old were actually built and destroyed just 300 years ago, then the entire familiar timeline crumbles. This strikes a blow to the authority of all educational institutions and religious organizations that have shaped the worldview for centuries. Second, acknowledging the cyclical nature of catastrophes breeds fear. If a highly developed civilization, possessing construction technologies we cannot replicate even today, was destroyed by a sudden cataclysm, then where is the guarantee that this won't happen again tomorrow? It is much easier for authorities to maintain the illusion of linear progress, where humanity gradually develops from a primitive state to the heights of civilization, than to admit that we are merely survivors on ruins, feral descendants of those who were much more powerful than us. We live in a world recovering from a reset, and elites who know the truth prefer to keep the rest of the population in ignorance, feeding them fairy tales about the Dark Ages and gradual rebirth to prevent panic and chaos. In this context, the figure of Piranesi takes on a tragic scale. He was not just an artist, but a keeper of memory, a man who tried to pass the truth to descendants through the only channel available to him: art. Under conditions of strict censorship and religious dictate, he could not write in plain text about what he saw. Therefore, he encrypted his messages in symbols and allegories. His famous Prisons series is not the fruit of a sick imagination, but, possibly, blueprints of giant technical structures of the past, the purpose of which was forgotten or distorted by the new masters of the world. Those very antique buildings we admire could have been erected just half a century before his birth, and then destroyed by a force of irresistible nature. Piranesi recorded the agony of the former world, masking it as a study of antiquity so that his works would pass censorship and survive for those who could read them centuries later. We are obliged to learn to look at his engravings not as pretty pictures for interior decoration, but as encrypted data files saved from the fire of history. Piranesi is a documentary filmmaker of the apocalypse, whose archive was carefully filtered, and many works were likely safely hidden in the Vatican vaults or destroyed. But even what remains is enough to understand. History is not linear. It is full of gaps, artificial splices, and periods of total oblivion. We live on the graveyard of a great era that was hidden from us, replaced by a surrogate from textbooks. Understanding this fact changes everything. It forces us to look differently at the foundations of our houses, at the oddities in architecture, and at the very essence of human progress. Piranesi tried to warn us that civilization is fragile, and that forgetting the past leads to a repetition of its tragedies. His voice breaks through to us across centuries through strokes on copper plates, and our task is to hear him before the cycle closes again. The truth is waiting for its hour, and when it finally comes to light, the world will never be the same. If this alternative look at history made you think and look at familiar things in a new way, make sure to hit the like button. And don't rush off. Right now, 2 videos have appeared on the screen that will even more strongly overturn your idea of the real past of our planet and reveal new details of the global falsification. Click and continue the investigation, because the most interesting part is yet to come.